I'm Amra Sabic-El-Rayess. I'm a faculty member at Columbia University Graduate School of Education, Health, and Psychology. I am also a faculty member affiliated with the Middle East Institute and Harriman Institute for Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union, also at Columbia University. So just by sharing that with you, you can probably guess that I have done a lot of international work over the years. And my work has primarily focused on a really simple mission, which is to understand the role of education in how societies fall apart, and then the role of education, constructive role of education in helping societies after wars, conflict, crisis, social transformations rebuild themselves. And with all sorts of events that we have witnessed in the United States in the last couple of years, in particular, rise in extremism and radicalization, my interests have expanded to applying some of the things that I've learned and studied internationally to what is happening in the United States. Specifically, how do we engage educators and education, formal and informal education, in preventing targeted violence and hate and extremism. And thanks to DHS and CP3, I have been able to turn one of the pilot projects with my students, and Lauren was one of those students. We spent a semester, and I think we had $1,000 or $2,000 of a budget. And Lauren and all of her classmates did an incredible job. And in fact, when the semester ended, they called me and they said, Lauren was one of those students, and said, we want to keep doing this with you. And I said, well, I have no money to pay you, and Columbia won't let me work with you unless I'm able to fund this. And they said, please, please, let's do it. And so we did it, but we did it only with the help of DHS. So we're deeply grateful for that. Today, we're going to talk, we could talk for hours about these issues, but today we're going to focus on reimagining resilience, specifically resilience to hate, and preventing what we call educational displacement. I'll talk about what that means, but I think you'll recognize what that means based on all of these discussions and incredible conversations we have had today. And we will also focus on the role of storytelling, role of narrative, societal, individual, and how meaningful narratives are in the process of either inciting violence, and in our case, we try to use it to prevent hate and build resilience to hate. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lauren Gonzalez.
Let's see. So yeah, as Amra said, well, that was part of our agenda, and then we have a short video that goes over our project. Let's see. And what Reimagine Resilience is.
Before they ended lives in Buffalo, El Paso, and Parkland, they were students who started down a similar path, a path that began with feeling invisible, resentful, and disconnected from their world. So they kept turning away and following a way that enabled others to lead them toward hate and even radicalization. But what if someone was there to say stop? What if it was a teacher like you? Together, we can help our students reconnect and reimagine life. Reimagine resilience.
So yeah, as Amra said, really just captures the essence of Reimagine Resilience, as well as the importance of educators within the space to really be that first step in preventing isolation and targeted violence. But for the first activity, what we want to do with you is really just going into and discussing storytelling. So if you will, please just take a few minutes. We have a little prompt for you as well. But looking at this image, what kind of story comes to mind? What details do you pull out and why? And what relationship do you see between the characters and the setting that they're in? So to do this, if you can, pull out your phones, or if you're on your computer, we have a little Menti code down there, but if you can scan the QR code, if I can get a thumbs up if someone gets it to work. Yep, okay, we see it's working. So just looking at this image, in a few lines, I think you have 120 or 100, 250 characters. Just please share the words and thoughts that come to your mind. What story would you tell? If we can pull up the...
It's not showing up. Maybe refreshing the page to make sure it shows up.
Yeah, if you can click that bottom icon down there.
Yeah.
Let's see.
If you could just make them visible, the comments. Yeah, maybe click on that to unhide. No, or hidden, okay.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, here we go.
Okay.
Yay.
Let's see, so we see a woman sheltering a cat in a torn neighborhood, a fire that destroyed the house, a city that was destroyed, only one woman left, survival of an individual, disaster, war caregiver, victim of a bomb, going off into the neighborhood and looking back.
A story of overcoming adversity and situations out of your control and holding on to the relationships that are meaningful, a girl protecting her cat from the dangers of the environment situation, a child whose community is destroyed, who is looking longingly at it with her cat. Go ahead, Lauren.
You see survival, seeking to hold on to hope and caring for loved ones, rebuilding in hope. Maybe the title of today's sessions are giving you guys a bit of a hint, but girl living in a war-torn area.
I love this one. The world as I knew it crumbled around me, nothing left, just me and Ginger the cat. I love the name. Mm-hmm. The cat left to find a future. Disaster strikes with 2 survivors. The girl survived the devastating loss in her village or country. Her cat survived with her. Earthquake forces people out of their homes, carrying precious belongings and loved ones.
See friendship in the face of destruction and trauma. Great.
Chelsea walks a little further in her adventure with Sims today. Her just as adventurous calico. She's seen this side of town before, so she doesn't spend all too much time staring or wondering.
I like this one in the corner too. A superhero came to save her. She was trying to save her cat from the villain. The villain chased her, and we can scroll down a little bit more. And the superhero took the villain, and that's how the town got destroyed. I love the creativity that you guys have.
It wasn't easy to pull Tabitha away from her pursuits, but Lauren managed it. It wasn't the earthquake that has deterred Tabitha from pursuing her perennial foe, the mice that ran rampant, but the call for food from Lauren had pulled her attention. Fantastic publishable stories here. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Powerless, displaced, lost history. If we could go to the next slide. Awesome. So you told us a number of different stories from your own sense of positionality and perhaps who you are. And this slide is just an example of similar responses that we get from educators that we work with. And this is one of our warm-up exercises in a course that is part of Reimagine Resilience. And so now we'll tell you a little bit more about the actual story. This is a cover for the book titled The Cat I Never Named, a story of love, war, and survival. It is a nonfiction book. It is my memoir. I am a genocide survivor in addition to being a faculty member. So I exist in this intersectional space of someone who is a victim of extreme form of targeted violence and someone who now works to prevent it. So you might wonder, how is it that I didn't become a terrorist, that I didn't become an extremist? And that question is a question that I seek to answer through the work that I do, not just myself, but also with amazing people like Lauren. And so to tell you a little bit more about The Cat I Never Named, the story is about Bosnian genocide. I am a Bosniak, Bosnian Muslim, who was targeted in that genocide by the Serb military between 1992 and 1995. I spent about 1,200 days living under a military siege without access to water, food, education, outside world, or ability to tell my own story of who I was and what I was experiencing at that time. I often say the most effective and simplest way for me to describe those years is to say that on a good day, a friend of a friend died. On a bad day, it was a close friend or a family member that died. Matsi, that you see, the calico that you see, I love the name Ginger. Matsi means kitty in Bosnian. Matsi was a refugee cat that came with refugees into my city of Bihać just before it was besieged. My family didn't want Matsi. We had no food for ourselves. And I, to be honest, and I'm honest about this in The Cat I Never Named, I was terrified of anything with claws because I was attacked by a German Shepherd when I was little. And we didn't want Matsi. But Matsi found her way into our hearts and became integral to my own survival during those years. On the very first day of bombing of my hometown of Bihać, my younger brother Dino and I were in a basement of a neighbor's house because my parents didn't have a basement in our home with multiple families. We were hiding. And then bombing stopped for a few moments. It was the first day of the war. We didn't know that it was really intended to draw us out onto the street so we could be killed. My younger brother Dino and I, without telling our parents, escaped from the basement, went back to our house to see Matsi because she was, in our minds at the time, a new member of our family. And when we got there, we saw 4 of our friends. Matsi wasn't there, but she was crying in the background. We called her to come out. She wouldn't come out. And so my brother and I stepped away in 2 different directions for a moment to find her. In that moment, a bomb fell and blew up 4 of our friends. So I wouldn't be here, I wouldn't be sharing my story with you, I wouldn't be doing the work that I do to prevent targeted violence if it were not for a stranger refugee cat that showed me love and humanity more than humans did at that time. So sharing this story with the world wasn't easy, as you can imagine. It's never easy, not even today. But the purpose was to model resilience and to provide and lend my voice to this resistance against hate that we're seeing on the rise. It is a way to humanize an individual who is subjected to hate of any kind. And this is the book that's now is being used in the classrooms in the United States and abroad. It has won one of the sort of the Oscars of the literary word type of awards, particularly for young adults and children. It is one of the top 5 nonfiction books for young adults in the United States for 2020, has gotten all other accolades after that, but I didn't write it for the awards. I wrote it so that we can use it with the teachers to teach empathy, collective empathy, and resilience to hate. And with that, I'll hand it over to Lauren. Thank you.
Let's see. So with that, we want to kind of engage and kind of think about how stories and how our own stories might impact how we view things. So as I'm sure many of you have noticed, your frame of knowing your frame of reference, your frame of background might have influenced the story that you told and the story that you saw within this photo. So I want to kind of go into that, and we're going to look into that a little bit deeper. So now that you shared your thoughts in Mentimeter and reflecting on what you thought the story was, kind of thinking about why did you choose that story and why did you choose those selected things that you did from that photo? So did you assume the close relationship between the cat and the main character? Did you recognize the destroyed mosque in the background as a symbol of the main character's Muslim identity and the reason behind the genocide? A couple more. Let's see, did you assume the character was a Muslim girl? Why or why not? And how might your own positionality and your context of your lived experiences inform the interpretation? So if we can go back to Mentimeter and just think about those questions, reflect on those questions. So how did your background and your own positionality or prior experiences shape your initial perception of that photo? We can click on the results again, thank you. I have to futz around with it. There we go. Oh, good.
The first response I did not assume the girl was Muslim because she had red hair. The most frequent question I've received in my life, or comment really, is, you can't be Muslim, you don't look like one. Just as a side note, Muslims, particularly in the United States, are racially most diverse group of all religious groups, and it's just a reflection of sort of the stereotype that we tend to associate with who is who based on their ethnic, racial, or religious identity.
See, having the shared experience of having a cat that also got them through tough times.
The war in Ukraine made me think of a war-torn area. The woman hugging cat made me think they comfort each other. I think my background helped me to highlight the positives on the pictures and see it as survival instead of just destruction. I have a cat that has helped me through traumatic experiences, so I assumed the girl in the picture has a close relationship with her cat.
I tend to view things in a positive way, also loving to make fun stories, great. The background with investigating, not to assume too many things, but just describe the observations, great. Being shaped by their own relationship with pets and knowledge of Amra's story.
I did not identify the mosque, and the girl was a Muslim. I wasn't able to see the detail of the mosque, and if I had, I would have automatically determined it was Bosnia. I know Muslims are diverse. I am one of them, and I love cats.
Let's see. Projected their own relationship with the cat and to the girl. I did not recognize the religious symbol or the building, potentially because I do not practice religion. The image reminded me of the stories that I learned of the Holocaust survivors that I met, and that of the stories of earthquake survivors that I would see in the news in high school. Great.
Thought of what the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol could have turned into without law enforcement protection. Others deserve the same protections. And close relation of watching 9/11 on a TV, so different than personal experience, certainly influenced close studies of terrorism, may desensitize perception of war-torn images.
Great, thank you all so much, and we'll go back to the
Thank you.
presentation. So with that, it kind of reflects on why does storytelling matter? And what do you think the purpose of the storytelling activity is? And as we alluded to, it's really kind of pulling out our own perceptions and how we view things. We know that storytelling is very useful in kind of questioning our own frame of understanding, getting different perspectives and voices, developing understanding, as well as widening our scope of curiosity. So with storytelling, it's really important to kind of build a new kind of class community and classroom culture where we have the acceptance of kind of these different competencies such as open dialogue, inquiry and engagement, prevention planning, self-awareness, community awareness, and social connection, and self-reflection, critical thinking, and perspective seeking. And as we know, educators are kind of the main proponent of that, but it's not only the role of the educators to kind of create that culture of openness. We need all educators and all educational professionals to be involved, whether you're an administrator, counselor, school resource officer. So kind of creating and changing that school culture. And as we know, violence doesn't start with violence doesn't always start with a physical act. It really starts with words. Direct violence and that physical response is really kind of the last iteration that we see. In a conversation we were having yesterday, we were talking about the use of memes, YouTube videos, and kind of perpetuating in those first instances of violence and creating biases. So we really see the use of elevating stories of resilience to violence to protect us from narratives of supremacy and othering. So in one of our courses, we really did want to explore this idea of what violence looks like and how do people perceive violence. So within our first course, we asked educators, are they aware that bias is a type of violence? And we asked them to define violence. What does it mean to you? And a lot of what they said were really those physical iterations and those physical expressions of violence, whether it be bullying, hitting, scratching. And then from there, we educated them on the different outlets of violence, so whether it be structural, cultural, or direct. And after that, those interventions, we really saw them acknowledging those more structural implementations of violence. So, and also when asked about violence, or when asked about biases, in a survey that we conducted in 2022, we asked them over 40 questions. We asked educators and students around 40 questions regarding their perceptions of biases and violence. And the top 3 types of violence that we saw, or biases that we saw, my apologies, were anti-Black bias, gender bias, and anti-Muslim bias. Students saying, we saw 27% of students saying that they saw or experienced instances or saw instances of bias daily, and we saw 49% saying weekly. Moreover, only 19% of students said that they read or analyzed stories that reflected their own lived experiences, and only 20% of students said that they read and analyzed stories that represented them. And while we know it's important to get a diverse array of stories and a diverse array of experiences and voices within schools, we really need students to be able to relate to the stories that they read to make sure they're most impactful.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you. So that brings me, just think about those statistics Lauren just shared. 19 or 20% of students are actually relating or seeing themselves represented in the stories that they read, and that's highly problematic. Why is it problematic? It puts them at risk of feeling educationally displaced. And that's the term that probably you're hearing today for the first time, because it is part of what we call educational displacement theory of radicalization that I have developed by working and understanding the pathways to radicalization of those who have radicalized internationally. And now we're taking that model with the help of this funding that we received from DHS, applying it to the US context to understand how the model plays out within the United States of America. So educational displacement for us is a risk factor to radicalization. What does it mean? Often youths when they do radicalize, based on our conversations with those who have radicalized, is that they experience a trigger event. There is a moment, there is an experience in the classroom, in the school setting, where they gain this feeling of being educationally displaced, being invisible. There's a loss of attachment or recognition by their community, by their teachers, by their peers, something that all of you have talked about today. And what we, in our model of radicalization, propose is the idea that actually that is the moment when radicalization began. It is, in a way, for educators too late sometimes to intervene when someone is fully radicalized. It becomes much more difficult. Yes, we can do it, but becomes much more difficult than for us to come in early on when we can prevent this feeling of being educationally displaced. And this sense of sort of invisibility that students tell us they feel. And by the way, we as adults might think it's real or perceived. It doesn't matter. It is real to those who are experiencing it. The sense of being invisible, being voiceless, not being heard. Why this sense of educational displacement emerges for different individuals, many of you discussed it. For someone, it might be a mental health issue. For someone else, it might be socioeconomic background. I worked on a project in Mongolia, not related to radicalization at all, several years ago, working on reforming educational system there and the use of educational inputs, books, pencils, school uniforms. And what I learned in the process is that kids who didn't have school uniforms to attend classroom or had cheaper school uniforms felt displaced and often dropped out and often experienced all sorts of issues socially because they didn't have that sense of belonging. So why educational displacement happens? There are many different markers. As I said, mental health issues, behavioral issues, socioeconomic issues. It could be children who are differently able. We talked about today learning disabilities. We know that there is overrepresentation of those with learning disabilities in our prisons today. And so how and why someone feels educationally displaced might be linked to their individual circumstances, but we call all of these sort of markers an issue or risk factor of educational displacement. Other research supports research that we have done. Just briefly, pandemic has led to enforced isolation for all of us. We all forgot social skills. I was so glad when I went out for dinner with my husband first time that he didn't show up in PJs. We all got used to remote instruction. I know what it felt for me to be teaching remotely without seeing my students' faces and feeling I'm speaking to myself rather than to a community of participants. That prolonged digital exposure has put many of us at the risk of radicalization. Absence of educator presence has heightened vulnerability. Just a conversation that we had now about at least one adult who cares, who's there for you, who holistically cares for a student beyond their academic performance has been a problem and has accelerated the pathway to radicalization for many. As social connectivity drops, we also know that the sense of moral resilience plummets. So moral resilience in a sense of no matter what is done to me or what I experience, I will never resort to an act of violence in response. And then educational displacement also links closely to the idea of moral disengagement. You've probably read the work of Bandura that we have to morally disengage from caring about that other. Dr. Bryan talked about us versus them, that binary worldview. You have to disengage morally from caring about that group in order to commit an extreme act of violence against them. So all of this literature really supports what we're also finding and calling a educational displacement. Just to expand on some of the statistics that we are seeing quite literally in a survey that is still being conducted, and I think we'll just keep it open for quite some time to continue to get sort of real-time information from students in the United States. We have so far collected a survey, and I want you to know there's more than 40 questions in the survey. You've been asked to fill out the survey today. We know how resistant we are to doing that. So we have really put together a thorough survey and collected it already from 520 educators and students. I'm going to highlight here, we don't have a lot of time to go into what educators said, but I want to highlight what students have said, which I think is critical. And this is what they shared with us. Only 30% of students say they never feel marginalized by their teachers. So the rest have experienced some form of marginalization, whether often, always, daily, weekly, but some form of marginalization. 35% of students say their teachers are like their mentors. So talking about perhaps those only 4 or 5, I think that's what Brooke, if I'm correct, has said, 4 or 5 individuals that act as mentors, but most teachers don't. 40% of students say they learn about issues they're concerned with. 44% say what they learn reflects their interests. 45% of students say their teachers include them in the classroom activities, which means that the other 55 do not feel included in one way or another. 45% of students say they feel a sense of belonging in their school. What do you notice that's common to all these statistics? Less than 50%. Less than 50%. I was depressed when we looked at these numbers. We have so much work to do together. We can't do it. None of us can do it alone, but together I believe that we can. So when we fail to provide educational content that addresses diverse needs of students in our classrooms, in our educational spaces, I'm going to say formal and informal, whether it's in school or after-school programs, we are helping educational displacement occur. That is when educational displacement begins, because students begin to look for other sources of social educational content that interests them, that makes them feel they have a sense of belonging, where they feel they're recognized, where their interests are addressed, where they feel listened to, and they can actively engage. If they don't get that in the classroom, we're losing them. And I need to learn how to use technology again. I'm sorry, I keep flipping. Two slides ahead. Oh, okay, it's not me. Hey. So another statistic, only 15% of students say they learn what they want and need in school and that they don't need to search for other sources of information outside school. Only 15%. Students from 40 states, more than 200 students as of today in terms of the surveys we collected. So when educationally displaced, we should be expecting that they will be going online. It doesn't mean everyone who is educationally displaced will radicalize, but it means that we're putting them at a higher risk of radicalization given the online space today. So this is just, we're not going to go into, I don't think we have enough time to go into all of the steps of the educational displacement theory or model of radicalization. We're showing a visual to you here. You can actually go to Reimagine Resilience. This is our logo in the corner, reimagineresilience.org. And there is a free open access, one of the studies, articles, scholarly articles that is also listed at the bottom as the source, where you can actually read the initial study that I did that began this research on educational displacement. But I want to highlight here that radicalization is not the moment, it's a process. And from our perspective, it's a process that begins with educational displacement. It doesn't begin when someone finds a narrative online and joins an extremist group. It begins because we failed to prevent educational displacement as educators. And as an educator, I know what's the burden that educators have to carry every day. And so our training that we developed is actually to help educators integrate the practices into already what they have to do in their schools, so that it's not an additional toolkit or an additional thing that they have to conquer, but we're trying to make their work easier. And we'll talk about that. We're also part of the panel, so we'll talk about that. Lauren will go into details of the curriculum that, as a resource, all of you can use. But again, to highlight here, the process begins with educational displacement because of the lack of storytelling, dialogue, agency, inclusion in the classroom, in social spaces, and that triggers that initial sense of lacking belonging, disconnect, disengagement, invisibility that ultimately makes them feel displaced. Like a refugee, and I've been there as a displaced person in my own country during the war in Bosnia. When you're not safe, you're not accepted, you're not acknowledged, you're seeking an alternative space of belonging. So like a refugee, if you're in a classroom and you're not seen, you're not heard, stories don't represent you, you can't relate to them, you're not getting information that you want, you're curious about, you are going to seek information elsewhere. And so how do we address this? Our entire training is designed so that each step in radicalization model is actually countered, or we develop a course that works to, one, educate teachers on what the risks are of, let's say, educational displacement, but also gives teachers tools and practices they can implement in the classroom to lessen educational displacement. But really, the idea behind it is, how do we now that we know what happens in schools and how one might travel that journey to full radicalization, can we build resilience to hate framework? And what should that framework include? So what we focus on is building essentially a new protective, preventive approach to radicalization through classroom practices and pedagogies that teachers can apply, and building various capacities. And some of those protective factors you all have already discussed: self-awareness, community awareness, belonging, storytelling, building the right kind of school culture where grievances can be effectively managed. Many of you discussed that today. Mentorship, positive mentorship, mentorship with boundaries that will be effective. Media digital literacy, critical thinking. So if one does encounter content that proposes certain sort of radical views, how do they handle that? How can they be protected against that exposure? Community building, engagement, social connectedness, collective empathy, allyship, nonviolent problem solving. These are all competencies that are built into our professional training for teachers. I have no idea where I'm supposed to turn this. Eventually, I'll learn by the end of the presentation. Okay. So here, just to highlight one of the prior research data collection projects that we did. It's actually our pilot that we completed during that one semester with the funding from DHS. We surveyed during that semester 240 education professionals from 20+ states. And what we learned is that 72% of educators were either hearing or seeing biases occur at their schools, often by students. 57% of educators were hearing or seeing biases occur at their school, often by their colleagues or their peers. So we need to address the question of biased speech and behavior, not only amongst students, but also amongst educators. And this goes to a question of, how can we expect an educator to do something if we haven't trained them? As a faculty member at the School of Education who trains educators, I know how very few of us work on the issues of extremism. So if our educators are not trained to address it, they cannot help us in schools in the classroom. So we need to do more of that across the board. Only 42% reported being confident in their own ability to address or combat biases. So this is 42% of surveyed educators. And with the caveat that it was really overreported in terms of educators with 10+ years of experience. So those who didn't have experience were not confident in addressing biases in their school environment. Only 23% reported being confident in their students' ability to address or combat biases. And I want you to really be ready for this next. We're going to need some hope after the next statistic. In the study that we're conducting now, only 1.6% of students believe all educators and staff at their school can effectively mitigate and address biases at school. Only 1.6% of students, less than 2%, believe that everyone in school has competence to address biases. Going back to the comment made before, kids might be talking about 2 or 3 teachers that they can go to, but not everyone in their school. Majority, 46.9%, believe only 1 to 2% of 1 to 2 educators can effectively address biases in their school. So half of those that we surveyed say there's 1 or 2 teachers, but not much more beyond that. And with that, I'm not sure how much hopefully we have some time for conversation. And I think there's a video, right? We're going to play a video, and then hopefully we can address some questions if we have more time. If we do have time? Excellent.
I don't think this one has video.
Thank you. Thank you. And with that, we're going to stop here. If we have time, we're happy to take questions before we go into the next panel. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for your presentation. So I really think the concept of educational displacement is really important. And I hesitate to ask this question for obvious reasons, but given the discussion even that we had earlier about CRT and the trends of, removing, certain books in schools and removing that concept and everything, I'm kind of wondering, what is your hope for the future of educators being able to address bias in a school given those trends? I don't know, it's not pervasive, it's a few handful of states, but I think it's something we got to talk about.
Excellent question. I actually appreciate that question. Let me address, and I'm going to invite Lauren to add her thoughts, but let me just address the question of language, something that I brought up during our initial conversation on several. As Brett said, I joined all of the committees because I wanted to learn about this network. And one of the issues that I brought up was the question of language. How can we change the language that we use in a way that we can enter spaces where the doors are closed right now? So it's easy for us at Columbia, it's easy for me with our network of alumni and educators who've taken all kinds of certificates or trainings at Columbia to, I think we have a list of 100,000 plus educators in our continuing education program through which this training would be offered. It's easy for us to sort of train those that already buy into the importance of addressing bias. But how do we get across the line those individuals who don't believe in it? And one of the things that we have been really lucky with is The Cat I Never Named. It's written as a novel. The Washington Post called it an innovative form of nonfiction that kids love to read. One of the books, there were other books listed in that specific article. And with that book, I entered many schools around the country and around the world where I talked about simply my own lived experience and story. Kids, educators, adults connect to a story. And I've received many comments from parents who said, my kid got this book in school, and I realized it's about a Muslim character, and I didn't want them to read it. So I took the book, read a couple of pages, and then it was 4 in the morning, and I'm still reading it. I really like your book, and I'm sorry that I had that perception. I knew very little about what happened in your part of the world. But what's happening with that story is that people are making the connections. So sometimes we have to take a story from a different context that hasn't been politicized in this country for individuals to open their mindset and say, I welcome that narrative, I understand it now, but in that process they can also make the linkages to what's happening here. So the reason we did the exercise at the beginning with all of you, very simple exercise. But the idea is for you to recognize and for the light bulb to go off to say, hey, I imposed my lived experience on the interpretation of that narrative, my own perspectives, my own worldview. And now when I hear the story, I'm open to hearing it, perhaps because it is not something that is politically contentious in this moment, because it happened to someone else somewhere else. And so I think that has been one way in which we have entered the conversation. But I will say that in terms of critical race theory in particular, or even diversity, equity, inclusion, Lauren knows this, when we talk about with educators across the country, we've spoken to educators in some of historically most segregated areas, cities, rural areas, and that's where we want to be. They tell us, if you even mention diversity, equity, inclusion, we're going to have a trouble with this population, that population. So there's always an ally who wants to bring us in. We work with them. But we're very careful in the language that we use. And I think that was brought up earlier as well. So we don't talk about bias in the training. We talk about assumptions. We also talk about resilience, because every parent wants their child to be resilient. But we also deliver the news that we want them to be resilient to hate. One point that I often make is that when we speak on these issues with educators or principals, the value of a story, like The Cat I Never Named, is not in me being representative of a particular group alone. That's not the only value, that you hear a story of a Muslim teen outside of a typical stereotype that has been produced through media for a number of years in the United States in particular. But the value is that if you tell this story to a child who's never heard or met anyone who is Muslim, they will actually be protected when they go online and find another narrative that uses Muslims as this othered group to radicalize and to evoke those emotions or eventually lead to a thrill to kill. So we talk about, in our training too, about the linkages between specifically Bosnian genocide being used as the narrative to radicalize. So if you actually learn about it factually and you are able to empathize with, in this case, survivor, you're going to be less likely to then hate someone who might have a similar background. And so we crack that binary worldview of us versus them through these narratives that evoke emotions. And I think, we need to do more of that. Clearly, students are telling us we lack stories that we are interested in and that we connect to.
Yeah, adding in, and apart from kind of language and really making sure that we're cognizant to use language which is inclusive to kind of all thoughts and all values. Really, what we've been seeing is that a large amount of parents are encouraging us to stray away from using terms such as SEL and CRT and all these more soft skills, and noting that it takes away from educating about the hard skills, math, science, et cetera. And with dwindling GPAs, I think parents are really nervous that with pushing these competencies, it's taking away from those other skills. So what we really try to push, and our goal with this is to really show the long-term benefits of this, that these skills are really important for their future careers and to be citizens and global citizens and being able to really participate in our economy. The words are escaping me, so, but yeah.
I'm sorry, I promised my manager to ask questions in every session, so I'm doing that. Well, I'm slightly confused whether I'm going to ask a question or make a comment, because I quite belong to a background sort of quite similar to what you have experienced. I'm afraid to share such instances or telling such stories to my kids, because it doesn't matter what age they are quite young or maybe at the teen. Kids and teens are very curious to know more and more in detail. So when I tell them what happened in Afghanistan, they will ask me who did it. Because my 7-year-old girl, she asked me recently why we are in the United States. And I had to respond her. And she's also sometimes watching news with me, which I try to avoid why she's there. But she definitely asked me who are Taliban and why they are killing people. I don't know, this is a question or a comment. Don't you think that the storytelling could have an adverse impact on our children and teens? Because maybe stories could differ, but the type of the stories that you have present and the type of the stories I have, they're quite intense, they're quite catastrophic, and they could have a very, very bad impact from my perspective on our children, because that will not stop by telling them the story. They will dig down more into it, do their own research, and this could maybe sort of make them to think who did it, and this could boost the hatred against certain ethnicity, group, political parties, or whatever. So this is one thing I just wanted to share with you, and that would be great to have your feedback. The second thing, the infographic you have shown in your presentation as the educational displacement, which you have named the major factor of radicalization. So what makes me more curious to know, don't you think that this is putting so much pressure on educators and fading away the roles and responsibilities of parents, the law enforcement, and other institutions within the community, and just putting the educators on a spot where it's a lot of pressure on them? Don't you think that, you know, if they do good, then everything is good, and if they miss something, then they are contributing something bad to the community or the society? Thank you.
Both excellent comments and questions. So to start with your second part, absolutely agree with you that, as I said even during the presentation, we need a holistic approach. We need a collective approach. So we want to work with coaches, we want to work with parents. This is just the first project that we've created, developing professional development specifically in training for educators, because they're this primary population that spends, one could argue, more time with K through 12 children than in many cases parents can. So this is space and time also for young individuals where their identities are fluid. As you said, your own children who want to learn, who ask questions, who want to explore. And so we want to give educators tools not to silence in the classroom, but to have an open dialogue and constructively engage. And that means learn in that process and build the knowledge basis and skill set in terms of critical thinking, digital literacy, so that when you go on Twitter and you hear the narrative of any extremist group, you actually can say no to that narrative and to that. We know they'll be exposed to it. The question is, how do we manage that exposure and how do we protect them through various competencies? So absolutely agree with you. The next training I would love to do is with parents, with veterans. In fact, we have proposal to work with peers. Someone mentioned earlier peer-to-peer interaction. We know that peer rejection is one of the major risk factors. We see that as well. So we want to educate high school students on how to deal with it. Last semester, I worked with a group of students developing a game for 4- and 5-year-olds, how to engage in these topics. And that brings me to your first question, which is, what is appropriate at what level? So, as an example, in The Cat I Never Named, which is labeled as young adult crossover, so appropriate for young adults and adults, I have just finished my second book titled 3 Summers that will be published on May 23rd, 2023 by Macmillan. The first one was published by Bloomsbury, which is going to be a middle grade. I was asked by Macmillan, FSG, which is their imprint for children's literature, could you please bring these tough topics that you talk about in The Cat I Never Named to age-appropriate conversation for middle graders to similarly give them a role model of resilience. Despite exposure to violence, you've managed to retain resilience. How did that play out in real life? So to basically inspire kids to, in a way, emulate that within their own context. So in that space, I think us closing our eyes to the fact that kids will go online and be curious and learn if we don't provide the content is not a solution. I would much rather handle tougher topics by training educators who will then train other educators who will then interact with students so that we know how to handle these conversations in the classrooms effectively, and that your children or my children or anybody else's children can learn of these topics in a constructive way, and that their response to these various challenges or traumas, we talked a lot about trauma, is not violence, but in fact, resilience to hate. Yeah. I don't know if you have anything to add. I think there's a question in the back.
Hello. Oh, thank you so much for your presentation. I definitely look forward to talking with you all afterwards because I deeply resonate with the work that you do, not just with our organization, Music in Common, but when I was 13 years old and I met Holocaust survivors who shared their story, and that set me on the passion for peace building and social justice. I know firsthand how important having safe, healthy spaces to process these things in a meaningful way can have in cultivating peace and tolerance within somebody. So thank you all for what you're doing.
Thank you.
So my question is, I think as you all just discussed, being able to create containers for students to be able to have these conversations, it can be burdensome if it's just the teachers alone, and you all are encouraging for folks to take a holistic approach. And there are organizations and groups like, shameless plug, like Music in Common, that specialize in creating containers for that. So my question is, what are recommendations you could provide for how maybe schools or education groups can cultivate partnerships or collaborations with groups and organizations that specialize in creating containers for these discussions to have? Like, any recommendations you have for that?
Thank you so much. Well, I think the first step is us connecting right here. And Lauren told me that she had an amazing conversation with you, and I said, we need to speak with you because we want to elevate the work that you do, and I say you individually, but also all of you, in the work that we do. I think those synergies we need to unify because there are so very few of us to address these really significant societal issues that we're experiencing. We're seeing more hate internationally. We're seeing more hate in the United States of America, and we need to act quicker, faster, better, and I think more preventively, not only focusing on intervention, but prevention. So in Reimagine Resilience, and during the panel, Lauren will do a presentation on what that looks like in terms of sort of structure of the training. We feature organizations that we have partnered with. So for instance, One World Strong, Dave Fortier, who we met through collaboration funded by DHS and CP3, and my team at Columbia have partnered to feature his work, and his app, his project is featuring what we're doing, and we're bridging out networks. So for instance, someone might have focus on New Hampshire or St. Louis. We need to come together and share those resources. We talked about us going to New Hampshire to deliver a workshop and featuring One Trusted Adult in our training, because we want to give those resources to teachers so that teachers can have these boundaries and say, okay, this is what I can offer to this conversation and what I can do in the classroom. That's what we will do in terms of professional training. But by the way, here is 25 or 35 other resources that you can leverage to support the work that you're doing. So for those kids who are creative and interested in music, they can, I wasn't that person. I was a math and physics nerd, so I would have been in a math club, right? But we need to have diversity of those resources and be able to share them. I don't think we do a great job of that. I think we're siloed into our little worlds, which is why I started, when I was doing my committee update this morning, saying I'm really grateful to DHS, to McCain, for bringing us together across disciplines.
If I can, Jan. One thing we also really leverage within our program is really to create a sense of community and network among the participants. So I've been really amazed to be able to talk with different educators across the country and see these really novel and really amazing efforts that they've been doing to create community and belonging and inclusivity among not only their peers, but among their students. So whether it be creating mentorship, internal mentorship programs to help with teacher attrition, or kind of like creating classroom guidelines among early childhood educators to help students become involved in the inclusivity process. And really just having those opportunities for educators to share with each other on what's working well in their classrooms. Because I think the biggest thing is that educators are the experts. We can come in and give them all the resources and try to give them all the knowledge that we can, but they're the ones that are on the ground implementing these amazing efforts. So we really want to create the opportunity for them to share those experiences with each other.
I apologize if I missed this. I had to go coin the meter. I would love to hear your process in being able to take such a personal story and bring it forth, and what motivated you to keep going.
To keep going? I became a teacher at the age of 16, 17, in Bosnia in the midst of genocide, because a lot of teachers were killed and many were injured. So my own home was bombed during the war, and in that moment, my mother who was a history and geography teacher, lost her hearing, so she became deaf instantaneously. Speaking of a trusted adult, when I needed her quite literally the most ever in my life, I lost the ability to communicate with her. And education was always a critical, as a Bosniak, as an ethnic Bosniak, I was discriminated against growing up in former Yugoslavia and felt a sense of educational displacement. I wouldn't have labeled it back then in this way, but certainly that was my experience. And so education was this sort of a space where I was building my own resilience during the war. And there was a moment when the Serb military was going to enter our city, and that meant that I would have likely ended up in a rape camp. There were concentration camps, rape camps. And my father, who's an intellectual, turned to me, and he was also an orphan his father was killed fighting Nazis in World War II, so he lost his father very young. And my father turned to me and said something along the lines of, his biggest regret is that he won't be able to protect me. And he said, Amra, if you survive, I might be killed and you might be killed. But if you survive, there's one thing that no one can ever take away from you, and that is your education. And so that was a turning point in my life where I said, I will do everything I can to change not my own life, but the lives in my community, even if it's for a day. At the time, I really did not expect. I was convinced that I wouldn't live for much longer. It was a question of how I would be killed, but it wasn't a question of if I would survive at all in my mind. And I thought, well, let's make the best out of it. And when my mom was injured, I ended up teaching in her school. I remember distinctly the first day of walking, hiding in cornfields because her school was very close to front lines, and so I could have been shot by a sniper. So I went through the cornfields and showed up with shoes full of mud in her school. By the way, to teach English. I was asked to teach English. I did not speak English. I was teaching myself English using my dad's old dictionary that he used and had in the attic of our home that he used as a college student to pick up girls on the beach in former Yugoslavia at the time. And so I memorized all the words. I'm a spell check in my household. I can spell any word you can think of. And so the school didn't have an English teacher. Teachers were killed, injured, some on the front line. So they said, well, you know more than the rest of us, so come and teach. And I remember walking into the classroom with 5th graders, and they're looking at my shoes, and we're all hungry. And I said, let's talk about ice cream. That was my first lesson in the classroom. And that's a moment where I felt I have a purpose. I can still, even in these desperate circumstances, I can still inspire someone. And therefore, I refuse to be dehumanized. I'm going to humanize myself and those around me within my own reach, within my own power. So that's what changed me. And as I spoke to one of you who is a psychologist, I do often wonder who I would have become had I not had those experiences. But I still like and enjoy and find a sense of purpose by doing what I do. And so in some ways, I think, we believe at times that we were meant to do certain things. And for me, it was education, education, education. Oh, sorry, you can tell that I'm a professor because I can go on forever. So for a long time, close friends would say, Amra, write your story. I have to say I was very afraid because of trauma. We talk about intergenerational trauma. And I thought, well, I packaged that nicely and can handle it and manage it now. I don't want to unpack it. And I don't know what the writing process will do to me. I also understood that there is a risk of going public with a story where I might become a target. I've had people make threats who are, let's say, on a far-right spectrum. And I knew I was taking that risk, but in my mind, sort of doing a cost-benefit analysis, I felt there was much greater benefit of impact of sharing the story and sitting down and writing. And it was a moment that happened in this country where there was a conversation about, publicly in the media, about potentially rounding up Muslims. There was that discussion around potentially a policy such as that. And my younger daughter came home and said, "Mom, what will happen to me if you're rounded up?" So that goes back to that question of choice. Do we choose for us to handle that story? Or do we allow our children to go figure out the answer on their own? I would much rather have a trained educator, an engaged, active listener, engage in a dialogue, open dialogue on that topic. And so in response to that moment, I sat down that day and wrote a couple of stories and sent them to a book agent who has asked me to consider writing a book, and the rest is sort of history. But were there moments where it was very difficult to write? Absolutely. As I completed the process, it was probably the most self-empowering process that I could have ever engaged in. So I tell everyone who, young people ask me, should I write my story? And I say, write it. Don't write it for the rest of the world. Write it for yourself. If the world gets to see it and it has an impact, great. But it will have an impact on you.
You're amazing.
Oh, thank you.